What is going on?
I don't understand.
Okay, stand back.
Why? Wait, no,
Stand back. I'll take care of this.
Jason, no!
I can't do this anymore.
I think it's time we talked.
It's finally quiet. I just need a moment to think. We have to move now before it gets worse.
I can still see you.
You need to listen to me right now.
I can still hear them.
It's just another rainy night.
I need you to be completely honest with me. I've got you. Stay with me. We don't have much time left.
What was that? We'll figure this out.
It's just the glass, nothing more.
This is the only way out.
I can't believe you're here. It's just a simple experiment. I'm right here. I've got you. We have to move now.
Stay low, it's close. It's still here. We need to keep moving before they find us.
I see you.
We need to move now.
Friends, if you want to know everything about the upcoming movie The Last House 2026, then make sure to like this video. If you are visiting our channel for the first time, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell. Friends, in today's video, the movie we are going to talk about is called The Last House 2026. In this video, we will discuss what this movie is all about, what viewers can expect from its story, and where audiences will be able to watch it. We will also talk about all the interesting facts and important information related to The Last House 2026. I will give you complete details about its release, OTT platform availability, digital release, and satellite television information whenever officially announced. Apart from this, we will discuss the movie's technical department, direction, cinematography, production design, music department, pre-production, filming, and post-production in detail. We will also talk about the reported or officially announced budget, box office performance, audience reception, and overall commercial response of the film. Friends, We will also discuss the storyline and plot of The Last House 2026 without giving away unnecessary spoilers. Along with the story, we will take a closer look at the star cast, characters, performances, character development, and the roles played by the different actors in the movie. We will also discuss what makes The Last House 2026 interesting, how effectively the filmmakers have handled its genre and atmosphere, and whether the movie delivers the kind of experience audiences are expecting from it. And finally, I will give a small and honest review of the movie, including its story, performances, direction, technical aspects, entertainment value, strengths, and weaknesses. So, friends, if you want to know everything about The Last House 2026, including its storyline, star cast, release information, OTT availability, production details, budget, box office, interesting facts, and review, then make sure to watch this video till the end. The Last House 2026, Plot and Narrative. The Last House takes a relatively simple survival premise and gradually expands it into a claustrophobic science fiction horror story about family, isolation, adaptation, and the human need to find meaning when the outside world becomes impossible to understand. The film follows a family of 4 who suddenly discover that they have been sealed inside their own home, with no obvious way to escape. Their resources begin to disappear, while an unexplained force outside prevents them from returning to normal life. Netflix describes the central premise as a family struggling to survive both dwindling supplies and the mysterious threat keeping them imprisoned. The beginning, an ordinary home becomes a prison. The narrative initially establishes the family and their home as something familiar and safe. Jason and End, played by Wagner Moura and Greta, are presented as parents trying to protect their children, Graham and Ruth. Their home initially represents comfort, privacy, and security, but that meaning changes almost immediately when the family realizes that they cannot leave. The important narrative decision is that the film does not begin with a detailed explanation of the disaster. Instead, the characters, and therefore the audience, are forced to discover the rules of their situation at the same time. The family does not immediately understand who or what has trapped them, why it happened, or how long the confinement will last. This uncertainty becomes one of the principal engines of suspense. The house, consequently, becomes more than a setting. It becomes a prison, a survival shelter, and eventually almost another character within the story. Director Louis Leterrier and production designer Kevin Jenkins reportedly designed House so that it could visibly age alongside the characters as their confinement continued. Household objects deteriorate, resources disappear, and the physical environment changes as time passes. The first major conflict, survival. Once the family understands that escape is not immediately possible, the story moves from mystery toward survival. At first, the characters still have access to many of the conveniences of ordinary life. But the narrative gradually removes those comforts. Food, medicine, clean water, and other necessities become increasingly important. The family has to stop thinking about surviving for a few days and begin thinking about surviving indefinitely. This creates a particularly effective conflict because the primary enemy is not simply a monster outside the house. Time itself becomes an antagonist. Every day that passes creates another problem. Supplies become harder to replace, the house deteriorates, and the psychological pressure increases. The family must learn new survival techniques, improvise solutions, and make decisions that would have seemed unimaginable at the beginning of the story. The premise therefore develops from a simple question, how can they escape? Into a much more complicated question, how can they continue living when escape may never come? The passage of time. One of the most interesting aspects of the narrative is its treatment of time. Rather than constructing the entire film around a conventional day-by-day survival story, the narrative allows the audience to understand that the family has been trapped for an extraordinarily long period. Reports about the completed film indicate that the family adapts to their confinement over approximately 5 years, transforming the story from a temporary crisis into an entirely different way of life. This passage of time dramatically changes the emotional impact. At the beginning, the family is still waiting for normal life to return. Later, survival becomes their normal life. That distinction is important because it demonstrates how adaptable human beings can be. The family gradually learns to grow food, conserve resources, and use whatever remains inside and around the house. Their relationship with the house also changes. What was once simply their home becomes their entire world. The narrative consequently explores the psychological consequences of long-term isolation rather than treating confinement simply as an action movie obstacle. The external threat. As the story progresses, the mystery surrounding the outside world becomes increasingly important. The family begins to realize that something outside is actively preventing them from leaving. The threat is connected to strange environmental phenomena, including relentless rain and mysterious aquatic creatures. The film gradually shifts from a contained survival thriller into a supernatural science fiction horror story. This is also where the narrative becomes deliberately more mysterious. Instead of providing every answer immediately, the film encourages the characters to interpret what they see. Are the creatures attacking humanity? Are they protecting something? Is the family being punished, tested, or simply caught inside a larger environmental transformation? The uncertainty gives the story a broader thematic dimension. The family is not merely fighting an enemy, it is attempting to understand a world whose rules have fundamentally changed. The emotional turning point. One of the narrative's most painful turning points involves the family's aging dog, Cassidy. The dog's decline emphasizes the brutal reality of their circumstances. As medicine becomes unavailable, the family is forced to confront the fact that survival inside the house comes with devastating sacrifices. Cassidy's death becomes an emotional reminder that determination and ingenuity cannot solve every problem. This moment is important because it breaks through the family's survival routine. Until then, survival can sometimes be treated like a technical problem. Find food, conserve supplies, protect the house, and remain together. But the loss of Cassidy demonstrates that survival also involves grief, guilt, and emotional consequences. The story, therefore, becomes increasingly concerned with what survival costs the survivors emotionally. Ruth's infection and the decision to take a risk. Another major turning point occurs when Ruth becomes seriously ill and needs antibiotics. At this stage, remaining inside the house is no longer necessarily the safest option. The family has spent years learning that the outside world is dangerous, yet Ruth's condition forces them to consider leaving their sanctuary. This creates one of the film's strongest narrative dilemmas. The family must choose between certain danger outside and potentially fatal danger inside, and eventually ventures through the sewer system in search of medicine, demonstrating how the narrative gradually transforms the characters from frightened victims into increasingly resourceful survivors. Their willingness to leave the security of the house represents a major escalation in the story. The narrative changes from defense to confrontation. The story's final act becomes more active because the family can no longer simply wait for the threat to disappear. The characters eventually manage to capture one of the creatures. This is a significant structural change because, for most of the film, the family has been reacting to circumstances beyond their control. Now they have something they can confront directly. The captured creature also changes the family's understanding of their situation. Instead of seeing the beings exclusively as monsters, the characters begin considering whether communication or compassion might be possible. This becomes particularly important because Ruth has maintained a more sympathetic perspective toward the creatures. Her belief that the beings may not simply be evil ultimately influences the family's final decision. The climax, compassion instead of destruction. The climax does not simply resolve the story through a traditional monster-killing sequence. Instead, the family ultimately chooses mercy. After capturing one of the creatures, the family has an opportunity to treat it as an enemy. Ruth's compassion changes that equation, and the creature eventually allows the family to escape. This gives the conclusion a thematic significance beyond physical survival. The narrative suggests that survival does not necessarily require destroying everything that appears threatening. That idea connects directly to the film's broader themes of coexistence, fear, environmental change, and humanity's tendency to view unfamiliar forces as enemies. The ending, escape and a new beginning. The final section of the film provides the family with something they have not experienced for years: freedom. Their home is ultimately destroyed or flooded, and the family escapes by boat. The image is significant because the house that once represented safety has finally become unsustainable. Their escape therefore represents both a physical and psychological transition. They are no longer prisoners of the house, but they are also no longer the same family that entered it. The family then attempts to contact other survivors, and the response they receive suggests that they may not be alone. This gives the ending a cautiously hopeful quality rather than presenting a completely definitive resolution. Conventional structure or nonlinear storytelling. The Last House largely follows a conventional chronological structure rather than relying heavily on nonlinear storytelling. The narrative moves forward from the initial confinement through the family's adaptation into increasingly dangerous encounters and finally toward their escape. However, the film does experiment with the audience's perception of time. Instead of constantly showing every stage of the family's confinement, the story uses the deterioration of the house, changing circumstances, and major events to communicate the enormous amount of time that has passed. Netflix specifically notes that the house was designed to evolve and age alongside the characters. This approach keeps the narrative from becoming repetitive. If the film literally showed every day of 5 years inside the house, the story would quickly become stagnant. Instead, it concentrates on meaningful developments and allows the passage of time to create emotional weight. Themes beneath the plot. The narrative works on several thematic levels. The first is isolation. The family is physically isolated from society, but the story also examines the psychological effects of being unable to interact normally with the outside world. The second is family unity. Jason and are forced to reconsider what it means to protect their children when conventional institutions, technology, and society are no longer available. The third is adaptation. The family survives because they learn to change. Their ability to improvise becomes more important than the comforts they previously depended upon. The fourth is the meaning of home. At the beginning, the house is a symbol of safety. By the end, it has become a symbol of confinement. The film therefore asks whether a home remains a sanctuary when leaving it becomes impossible. Finally, the story explores fear of the unknown. The creatures initially appear to be pure threats, but the eventual possibility of communication complicates that interpretation. Overall narrative impact. From a narrative perspective, The Last House is strongest when it concentrates on the psychological consequences of confinement. Its basic premise is simple, but the prolonged isolation allows the story to examine how a family changes when an emergency stops being temporary and becomes their entire existence. The film also deliberately keeps some mysteries unresolved. The exact purpose of the creatures and the complete explanation for the family's imprisonment are not presented in a straightforward manner, encouraging viewers to interpret the events themselves. Some critics have considered this ambiguity intriguing, while others have argued that the unexplained elements create plot holes and weaken the story's logic. Ultimately, The Last House uses a conventional forward-moving survival structure but places its emphasis on psychological endurance, family relationships, environmental uncertainty, and the transformation of a safe home into a prison. The story begins with a family simply trying to understand why they cannot leave, develops into a long-term struggle for food, health, and sanity, and concludes with the family choosing compassion and taking a chance on an uncertain future. That progression gives the film a clear dramatic arc: confinement, adaptation, loss, confrontation, compassion, escape. In The Last House, character development is one of the most important elements because the story is built around a family forced to live under extraordinary circumstances. Rather than relying entirely on external action, the film uses prolonged confinement to examine how fear, responsibility, love, grief, and adaptation gradually change the characters. The four central family members, Jason and Graham and Ruth, do not simply remain the same people from beginning to end. Their circumstances force them to reconsider what safety means, how far they are willing to go for one another, and whether survival is enough when the world around them has fundamentally changed. Jason, from protector to survivor. Jason begins the story primarily as the family's protector. His first instinct is to keep his wife and children safe inside the house and to understand the rules of their imprisonment. His character initially represents control and responsibility. He wants to find logical explanations for what is happening and establish practical methods of survival. However, the longer the family remains trapped, the more difficult it becomes for him to maintain that sense of control. That creates an important internal conflict. Jason can protect his family from immediate threats, but he cannot control the larger forces responsible for their situation. He cannot stop the environmental changes, guarantee an unlimited supply of food and medicine, or prevent his children from growing up in isolation. His development, therefore, comes from accepting that protection does not always mean controlling the outcome. As the story progresses, Jason becomes more adaptable. Instead of simply trying to restore the family's old life, he learns to work with the reality they have been given. The transformation makes him more than a conventional survival movie father. He becomes someone who understands that leadership sometimes means making painful choices without knowing whether those choices will succeed. And from mother and caregiver to active survivor, Anne's development is equally important because she begins largely from the perspective of protecting her family emotionally and physically. Her relationship with Jason provides another layer to her character. Both parents want the same fundamental thing, keeping the family alive, but they do not necessarily approach every problem in exactly the same way. As the situation deteriorates, Anne becomes increasingly willing to take personal risks. Her journey outside the house in search of antibiotics for Ruth represents a major turning point. The decision demonstrates that she is no longer simply reacting to circumstances. She is actively confronting them. This transformation is especially significant because the outside world has been established as extremely dangerous. Anne understands the risks, but decides that staying inside can be equally dangerous if her daughter cannot receive the treatment she needs. Her motivation, therefore, changes from protecting the family through caution to protecting the family through action. That makes her one of the film's most important examples of adaptation. Ruth, the character who challenges fear. Ruth arguably undergoes one of the most thematically significant transformations. As a young member of the family, she initially experiences the crisis differently from her parents. She grows up inside the house and therefore does not have the same emotional attachment to the world that existed before the disaster. This distinction becomes increasingly important. For Jason and Anne, the outside world represents danger and the possibility of losing everything. Ruth, however, becomes more open to the possibility that the creatures outside may not simply be monsters. Her curiosity and compassion ultimately challenge the assumptions made by the adults. This is particularly important because the film's conflict is initially built around the idea of us versus them. The family believes the creatures are a threat, while Ruth gradually recognizes that the situation may be more complicated. Her development, therefore, moves beyond ordinary coming-of-age storytelling. Ruth learns about the dangers of the world, but she also refuses to allow fear to completely determine how she sees that world. Her compassion eventually becomes essential to the resolution of the story. Graham, growing up inside a crisis. Graham represents another consequence of long-term confinement, a child forced to mature under abnormal circumstances. Unlike children who grow up in a normal society, Graham has to develop his understanding of responsibility within the limited world of the house. His experiences gradually teach him practical survival skills, but they also expose him to emotional realities that children would normally encounter much later. His relationship with his parents becomes particularly important because the family is not only trying to survive together, they are also trying to maintain something resembling a normal family structure. Graham's development therefore reflects the loss of childhood innocence. The longer the family remains trapped, the less realistic it becomes for the children to simply depend on their parents for everything. The circumstances force them to become participants in the family's survival rather than passive observers. Jason and Anne, a partnership under pressure. The relationship between Jason and Anne is one of the film's most important sources of character development. Their marriage is tested by circumstances that cannot be solved through ordinary communication or compromise. Both characters experience fear, exhaustion, frustration, and grief. However, they also share the same fundamental motivation. Their children must survive. This common purpose prevents their relationship from becoming merely a source of conflict. Instead, Their partnership demonstrates how prolonged crisis can both strengthen and strain a relationship. Jason's desire to protect the family and Anne's willingness to take increasingly dangerous action can create tension, but their differences also complement one another. Jason tends to represent stability and planning, while Anne increasingly represents action and adaptability. Together, they demonstrate that survival requires both qualities. Parents and children, a changing family dynamic. The family relationship changes dramatically because the children cannot remain dependent forever. At the beginning, Jason and Anne are clearly the decision-makers. They determine what the children can do, where they can go, and how they should respond to danger. But years of confinement gradually alter that hierarchy. The children gain knowledge and experience, while their parents are forced to recognize that they cannot protect them from every danger. This creates a more complicated family dynamic. The children begin to have their own interpretations of the outside world, particularly Ruth. Her willingness to consider a different relationship with the creatures challenges the assumptions of her parents. The film consequently uses the family to explore a broader question. Should survival depend entirely on fear and control, or can survival also require trust and openness? Ruth and the creatures, the most important thematic relationship. Ruth's relationship with the mysterious creatures becomes especially important because it connects character development directly to the film's central conflict. Initially, the creatures are viewed primarily as dangerous outsiders, but Ruth gradually questions that interpretation. Her perspective introduces empathy into a story dominated by fear. She recognizes that something can be frightening without necessarily being evil. This becomes a crucial development because the family's ultimate escape depends partly on abandoning the assumption that the creatures must be destroyed. Ruth's compassion consequently affects not only her own character arc, but the direction of the entire narrative. She becomes the character who helps transform the story from survival against an enemy into survival through understanding. The family's response to loss. The death of Cassidy, the family's aging dog, also contributes significantly to character development. Cassidy's death is emotionally important because the dog represents the family's connection to their previous life. The loss reminds the family that even with careful planning, they cannot save everyone. For the parents, this creates another layer of guilt and helplessness. For the children, it becomes another painful lesson about the reality of their situation. The event therefore strengthens the film's larger theme that survival has a cost. The characters do not simply become stronger because they survive. They also carry emotional scars from what they were unable to prevent. Are the characters layered? Overall, the central characters are reasonably layered, particularly because their personalities are revealed through decisions rather than extensive exposition. Jason's character is shaped by responsibility. Anne's is shaped by determination and maternal protection. Graham's is shaped by forced maturity. Ruth's is shaped by curiosity and empathy. These characteristics become increasingly important as the circumstances become more extreme. However, the film's character development is primarily functional and thematic rather than deeply psychological. Some supporting characters and emotional transitions receive less attention because the narrative focuses heavily on the survival premise and mystery surrounding the outside world. This means viewers looking for extremely detailed psychological characterization may find some arcs relatively straightforward. How their motivations drive the story. The characters' motivations are directly responsible for the major developments in the plot. Jason's motivation is protection. His desire to keep the family safe keeps him focused on establishing rules and maintaining order. Anne's motivation is preservation of her children. Her willingness to take risks pushes the story beyond the boundaries of the house. Graham's motivation is survival and adaptation. His growth reflects the children's gradual transformation into capable members of the family. Ruth's motivation is understanding. Her refusal to automatically view the creatures as enemies ultimately opens another possible path toward survival. This is an effective structure because the plot does not simply happen to the characters. Their individual beliefs influence how they respond to every major crisis. Character arcs and the film's larger message. The character arcs ultimately reinforce the film's central themes. At the beginning, home equals safety. By the middle, home equals survival. By the end, the characters understand that home cannot remain a prison forever. The same transformation occurs within the family. They begin by trying to preserve their old lives. They then learn to adapt to their new reality. Finally, they accept that survival requires leaving behind the world they constructed inside the house. This gives the characters a meaningful emotional progression. Overall assessment. The character development in The Last House 2026 works best when it connects the family's personal struggles with the film's larger themes of isolation, survival, adaptation, and compassion. Jason evolves from a father trying to control an uncontrollable situation into a survivor capable of accepting uncertainty, and develops from a protective mother into someone willing to confront danger directly. Graham represents the painful loss of childhood normality, while Ruth becomes the emotional and thematic bridge between the isolated human family and the mysterious world outside. The strongest character arc belongs to Ruth, because her empathy ultimately challenges the family's understanding of the central threat. Her development demonstrates that surviving an unfamiliar world may require more than strength and caution. It may require curiosity, trust, and the willingness to question assumptions. As a result, the characters are not simply present to move the survival plot forward. Their relationships and individual transformations gradually determine how the story develops, making the family's emotional journey almost as important as the mystery surrounding the world outside their house. The performances in The Last House are among the film's strongest elements, particularly because the movie depends heavily on a small group of actors carrying an increasingly isolated and emotionally demanding story. The central family spends much of the film trapped inside one home, meaning the actors cannot rely on constant changes of location, large action sequences, or an expansive ensemble to create interest. Instead, the performances have to communicate fear, exhaustion, frustration, affection, grief, and adaptation through relatively intimate interactions. The film stars Greta Lee as Riley and Wagner Moura as Jason, with a supporting cast that includes Sid Edwards, Max Richardson, Gabriel Barbosa, Emma Ho, Riley Chung, and Noah Alexander Sosnowski. Netflix identifies Lee, Moura, and Gabriel Barbosa among the principal cast members, while the wider cast fills out the family and surrounding world. Wagner Moura as Jason. Wagner Moura delivers arguably the most commanding performance in the film. Jason is written as a father whose primary instinct is to protect his family, but the situation gradually makes that responsibility almost impossible. The character must deal with dwindling resources, uncertainty, physical danger, the deterioration of his home, and the psychological consequences of being unable to guarantee his family's future. Moura handles this pressure by making Jason feel increasingly worn down rather than turning him into a stereotypical action hero. His performance works particularly well because Jason does not always need to explain what he is feeling. Moura communicates much of the character's anxiety through facial expressions, pauses, posture, and changes in his physical energy. Early in the story, Jason can still behave like an ordinary father attempting to solve an extraordinary problem. As the years pass, however, Moura allows the character's body language to become heavier and more exhausted. His performance reflects the accumulation of years spent living under constant uncertainty. That gradual deterioration is important because the film's premise depends on the audience believing that the family's confinement has genuinely changed them. Moura's emotional control. One of Moura's strongest qualities is his ability to avoid excessive melodrama. Jason experiences several situations that could easily have been played with exaggerated shouting or emotional outbursts. Instead, Moura often keeps the emotion contained. That restraint makes the character's more intense moments more effective. When Jason becomes frightened, angry, or desperate, the performance feels like an escalation from everything that came before rather than an actor suddenly announcing that the scene is supposed to be emotional. This is one reason several critics have singled out Moura as a strength of the film. The Guardian specifically described his performance as strong, while other reviews similarly argue that Moura and Lee provide emotional credibility that the screenplay sometimes lacks. Greta Lee as Riley. Greta Lee provides the other essential half of the film's central relationship. Her character is not simply required to react to Jason. She has her own fears, instincts, and determination, particularly when the family's survival becomes increasingly uncertain. Lee's performance is strongest when the character is balancing two contradictory emotions, fear and determination. She has to communicate that and understands how dangerous the situation is while simultaneously refusing to allow that fear to completely control her decisions. This becomes especially important when the family needs medicine and the safety of remaining inside the house becomes questionable. Lee makes those scenes emotionally convincing because the character's motivation is never simply about personal bravery. Her decisions are connected directly to her responsibilities as a mother. Lee's performance in the family scenes. Lee also contributes substantially to the film's domestic realism. The movie works best when it resembles a family drama occurring under impossible circumstances rather than a conventional creature feature. In quieter scenes, Lee's performance helps preserve that feeling. Her interactions with Jason demonstrate a relationship that existed before the crisis. The characters are not simply two actors standing together to explain the plot. They are a couple who have accumulated years of shared experiences, disagreements, affection, and responsibilities. That chemistry becomes particularly valuable because the film spends so much time inside the family home. A review from the Houston Chronicle specifically praised the chemistry between Moura and Lee, arguing that their performances provide much of the movie's emotional resonance even as the story becomes increasingly complicated. Wagner Moura and Greta, Lee together. The strongest aspect of the lead performances may actually be the interaction between Moura and Lee. Their chemistry gives the family dynamic credibility. The two actors do not always play the same emotional note. Jason tends to approach problems through responsibility and protection, and can become more emotionally direct and action-oriented. That difference creates natural tension. The relationship, therefore, does not feel completely harmonious, but neither does it become an artificial argument machine designed only to generate drama. Instead, their disagreements arise from the impossible circumstances surrounding them. The actors make the audience believe that both characters genuinely want the same thing, protecting their children, even when they disagree about how that objective should be achieved. That distinction is crucial. Their relationship is ultimately based on shared love rather than identical personalities, and Moura and Lee communicate that effectively. The performances during long-term isolation. One of the most demanding aspects of the film is that the characters remain confined for years. That requires the actors to portray not just immediate fear but the psychological effects of prolonged isolation. A performance that remained at the same emotional level throughout the movie would quickly become repetitive. Instead, the actors have to show gradual adaptation. The family learns how to ration food, maintain the house, survive without normal outside communication, and establish new routines. Their performances consequently become less frantic as their circumstances become more familiar. That is an important acting challenge. The characters eventually understand that this is no longer a temporary emergency. It is their life. The actors communicate that shift through smaller details rather than constantly announcing it through dialogue. The children and supporting performances. The younger members of the cast have a different challenge. They must portray children who are growing up in an environment that is completely abnormal. The performances therefore need to communicate both vulnerability and adaptation. Sid Edwards and Max Richardson are part of the supporting cast, while Netflix also lists Gabriel Barbosa, Emma Ho, Riley Chung, and Noah Alexander Sosnowski among the film's cast. Their presence helps expand the story beyond the two parents. The children make the stakes more personal because the adults are not simply fighting to preserve their own lives. They are attempting to protect the next generation from a world they themselves do not understand. The younger performances are particularly important during quieter family scenes, where the film has to establish the idea that these children are growing up under circumstances that would normally be unimaginable. Ruth's emotional importance. Ruth is especially significant because her perspective gradually challenges the family's assumptions about the creatures outside. Her character provides a different emotional response to the crisis. Where the adults naturally associate the outside world with danger, Ruth demonstrates curiosity and empathy. That means the performance has to avoid making her seem unrealistically fearless. The more effective interpretation is that she is capable of being frightened while still being willing to question what the adults believe. That emotional distinction makes her character important to the film's eventual thematic direction. Her compassion eventually becomes connected to the family's ability to escape, meaning the performance is not simply supporting the emotional story, it contributes directly to the film's resolution. The dog and the emotional performances. One of the film's most emotionally difficult sequences involves Cassidy, the family's elderly dog. The scene has received considerable attention because it creates a surprisingly strong emotional response. The performers have to communicate genuine grief while maintaining the realism of a family that has been trapped for years. Greta Lee and Wagner Moura have discussed the difficulty of filming the sequence, including the unusual challenge of performing grief around an animal actor that was, in reality, healthy and playful during filming. That contrast makes the sequence particularly interesting from an acting perspective. The audience sees characters experiencing genuine emotional devastation while the actors themselves are working within the artificial environment of filmmaking. The fact that the sequence generated such strong audience reactions suggests that the performances succeeded in making the family's attachment to Cassidy believable. Supporting characters and the wider world. The supporting cast does not receive the same amount of development as the central family. That is partly a consequence of the film's contained structure. The narrative is primarily interested in Jason and their children, so surrounding characters function more as glimpses of the outside world and reminders that the family's experience exists within a larger crisis. Some supporting characters consequently feel more functional than fully developed. This is one area where the film's screenplay limits what the actors can accomplish. A talented actor can add personality, subtlety, and emotional detail, but if a character has limited screen time or primarily exists to provide information, the performance cannot develop into the same kind of layered portrait created by Moura or Lee. Do the performances overcome the script? To a significant degree, yes. This is one of the clearest patterns in the critical response to the film. Several reviews have argued that the performances are stronger than the material surrounding them. Decider, for example, praised the strong performances from Moura and Lee while criticizing the increasingly implausible screenplay. That distinction is important. The actors cannot completely solve problems involving plot logic, exposition, or unresolved questions. However, they can make the family itself believable. And that is exactly where the performances provide the most value. When the movie concentrates on the family trying to ration supplies, communicate with one another, deal with grief, or decide whether to risk leaving their home, the actors give the story emotional weight. When the narrative moves toward more elaborate explanations involving the supernatural creatures, some of that credibility becomes harder to maintain, not because the actors suddenly become weaker, but because the material itself becomes more difficult to ground emotionally. The strength of the lead ensemble. The lead ensemble succeeds because each performer contributes something different. Wagner Moura provides intensity, authority, and emotional restraint. Greta Lee provides vulnerability, determination, and emotional warmth. The younger performers contribute innocence and adaptability, emphasizing the generational consequences of the family's imprisonment. The supporting cast helps establish that the crisis extends beyond the central home, even though the film does not give every supporting character extensive development. Together, they create the impression of a family rather than simply a collection of characters fulfilling different plot functions. Chemistry and believability. The chemistry between the principal actors is particularly important because the story depends on family relationships. The audience has to believe that Jason and love each other, trust each other, disagree with each other, and remain committed to one another under extraordinary pressure. Moura and Lee generally accomplish that. Their performances are most convincing in moments where they are not explicitly discussing the crisis. A look across the room, a moment of hesitation, a quiet argument, or an exhausted reaction can reveal the condition of their relationship more effectively than a lengthy speech. That kind of restrained acting is especially useful in a movie where the characters spend so much time inside the same environment, where the performances are less successful. The performances are not completely immune to the screenplay's weaknesses. Some dialogue is reportedly cliched or overly explanatory, and certain emotional moments are constructed so obviously that the actors have limited room to make them feel natural. The Guardian noted that cliched dialogue undermines some of the film's potential, while other reviews have criticized the script for becoming increasingly convoluted. This means that even strong performances occasionally encounter material that feels artificial. The problem is particularly noticeable when characters are required to explain the movie's themes or supernatural mythology through dialogue. The actors are more convincing when they're experiencing the situation than when they're explaining it. Overall performance assessment. Overall, The Last House benefits significantly from its principal cast. The performances of Wagner Moura and Greta are the film's biggest acting strengths, and their chemistry provides the emotional foundation that keeps the family story engaging even when the larger plot becomes increasingly unusual. Critics have repeatedly identified the two leads as among the film's strongest elements. Moura gives Jason a believable mixture of strength, fear, exhaustion, and paternal responsibility. Lee gives an emotional intelligence and determination, making her more than simply a supporting figure in Jason's story. The younger performers help communicate the long-term consequences of isolation, while the supporting cast provides additional texture to the world surrounding the family. The performances ultimately succeed because they keep the film emotionally grounded. Even when the supernatural elements become increasingly difficult to accept, the family's fear, grief, love, frustration, and determination remain recognizable. In that sense, the actors are doing some of the film's most important work. They make an increasingly extraordinary story feel personal. Louis Leterrier's direction in The Last House is built around a strong central idea, taking an ordinary family home and transforming it into a place of uncertainty, confinement, and psychological pressure. Rather than immediately turning the film into a conventional creature feature, Leterrier initially treats the situation as an intimate survival drama. The family is trapped, their resources are limited, and nobody understands why the house has suddenly become impossible to leave. That approach gives the opening portion of the film a restrained, claustrophobic atmosphere before the story gradually expands into science fiction horror. Louis Leterrier brings experience from large-scale action and genre productions such as The Incredible Hulk, The Transporter, Now You See Me Too, and Fast X, but The Last House requires a different kind of directorial control. Instead of depending primarily on spectacle, the film asks him to generate tension from a limited environment and from the changing psychological condition of a family, creating a claustrophobic tone. One of Leterrier's clearest directorial choices is the way he turns space itself into a source of tension. The house is supposed to represent security. It is the place where the family should be able to close the doors, lock the windows, and escape the dangers of the outside world. Leterrier deliberately reverses that expectation. Once the family discovers that they cannot leave, the same walls that once represented protection begin to feel oppressive. This creates a particularly effective contradiction. The house is simultaneously their safest location and their prison. Leterrier's direction repeatedly reinforces this idea by keeping the audience aware of the physical boundaries surrounding the characters. Doors, windows, rooms, hallways, ceilings, and exterior barriers become visually important because every possible exit represents another failed opportunity for freedom. The director therefore does not need to introduce a monster in every scene to create tension. The architecture itself becomes part of the suspense. Netflix's description of the film similarly emphasizes that the family is suddenly sealed inside the home and must survive as their resources diminish, turning an ordinary home into a horror setting. Another effective directorial choice is the gradual transformation of the familiar domestic environment. At the beginning, the house looks like a normal family residence. The characters eat, communicate, move between rooms, and perform everyday activities. As the story progresses, however, those same spaces acquire different meanings. A kitchen becomes a place where food has to be carefully rationed. A bedroom becomes a place of emotional exhaustion. A window becomes a reminder that freedom exists only a few feet away. A door becomes an obstacle rather than an entrance. This transformation allows Leterrier to generate horror without constantly relying on conventional horror imagery. The environment becomes frightening because the audience understands what the characters have lost. The shift from domestic drama to science fiction horror. One of the more ambitious aspects of Leterrier's direction is the film's gradual movement between genres. The first part is essentially a contained family survival thriller. The middle section becomes increasingly mysterious. The later portion introduces more overt science fiction and horror elements involving the strange external phenomenon and the creatures surrounding the house. This progression allows the director to change the audience's expectations. At first, viewers are encouraged to ask, how can this family escape? Then the question becomes, what is happening outside? Eventually it becomes, what exactly is responsible for their imprisonment, and can the family coexist with it? That expansion is ambitious because the film begins with an extremely intimate premise and eventually tries to connect that premise to a much larger environmental and supernatural mythology, mood, and atmosphere. Leterrier's strongest directorial achievement is arguably the film's atmosphere. The persistent rain and isolation create a bleak visual environment. The outside world is rarely presented as an inviting place. Instead, it becomes something distant, threatening, and increasingly unfamiliar. The weather is particularly important because it prevents the characters from simply waiting for normal conditions to return. Rain becomes more than weather. It becomes part of the imprisonment. The director uses this environmental condition to maintain a feeling that the family is surrounded by something they cannot understand. The Guardian noted that the early sections successfully capture the mundane realities and emotional strain of prolonged isolation, even though the later science fiction elements are less effective. That observation highlights an important characteristic of Leterrier's direction. The grounded portions are often more controlled than the more extravagant ones. Pacing, slow burn before escalation. The pacing follows a deliberate escalation. Instead of immediately presenting the full explanation of the situation, Leterrier allows the family to discover the problem gradually. The early scenes concentrate on uncertainty. The middle portion concentrates on adaptation. The later portion concentrates on confrontation and escape. This structure gives the film a slow burn quality at first. The family has to test doors and windows, understand the limitations of their environment, manage supplies, and establish routines. That material can feel deliberately mundane, but its purpose is to make the audience understand how extraordinary the confinement becomes when it continues for months and years. The passage of time is therefore important to the direction. The movie does not simply present the family as people who have been trapped for a few days. Their environment and behavior change as the confinement continues, making the house itself a visual record of their survival. The passage of time as a directorial tool. The long duration of the family's confinement gives Leterrier an opportunity to show environmental and psychological transformation. Instead of treating the house as a static set, the direction allows it to become increasingly associated with survival. The family develops new routines. Their priorities change. Their relationship with the outside world changes. Their understanding of what constitutes a normal life changes. This is an important directorial decision because the film's central concept depends on the idea that temporary isolation eventually becomes permanent isolation. The longer the characters remain inside, the more difficult it becomes to remember what ordinary life looked like. Shot composition and spatial awareness. The cinematography by Paul Ulvik Roxeth works closely with Leterrier's approach. The production credits confirm Roxeth as the cinematographer, with Jeremy Crichton and Thomas Lambert handling editing. The visual strategy generally emphasizes the relationship between people and confined spaces. Wide compositions can make the characters appear small within the house, emphasizing how little control they have over their surroundings. Closer framing, meanwhile, creates psychological pressure by limiting what the audience can see. That contrast is useful for suspense. A wider shot can remind viewers that the family is trapped inside a physical structure. A tighter shot can make the same structure feel almost suffocating. The effect is that the film's visual language repeatedly returns to the central idea of confinement. The importance of windows and doors. The repeated visual presence of windows and doors is especially appropriate for this story. Normally, these objects represent movement and freedom. A door allows someone to leave. A window allows someone to look outside. In the last house, however, those functions are disrupted. The family can see the outside world, but cannot access it normally. This creates a particularly frustrating form of visual storytelling. The audience can see freedom, but the characters cannot reach it. Leterrier consequently turns ordinary architectural elements into recurring symbols of captivity, keeping the threat partially hidden. The director also makes use of limited information. The audience does not immediately receive a complete explanation for the mysterious force keeping the family inside. This approach creates suspense because the characters themselves do not understand what they are dealing with. The mystery surrounding the creatures and the environmental phenomenon becomes an important part of the film's early tension. The Daily Beast described the film as maintaining an intentionally vague mystery, while Decider criticized the eventual explanations for becoming increasingly confusing. That difference is important. The ambiguity works well when it creates curiosity. It becomes less effective when the eventual answers do not feel sufficiently coherent. Leterrier's use of genre. Leterrier's background in action filmmaking is visible in the moments when The Last House moves beyond quiet family drama and into physical danger. The director understands how to create movement and escalation. However, the film's strongest moments are not necessarily its largest ones. The contained sequences often generate more tension because the audience understands the stakes and the physical limitations. When the movie becomes more dependent on supernatural creatures and large-scale visual effects, the atmosphere becomes less intimate. This is where the direction becomes somewhat uneven. The Guardian described Leterrier's work as polished but uneven, suggesting that it fits the streamlined entertainment style of a Netflix genre movie more comfortably than a fully cinematic horror experience. The influence of contained thriller storytelling. The directorial approach places The Last House in the tradition of films where characters are trapped in a limited location and must discover the rules governing their imprisonment. The premise naturally recalls contained thrillers such as 10, Cloverfield Lane, and survival-oriented horror films, such as A Quiet Place. Decider specifically noted similarities to those movies while arguing that The Last House does not maintain the same level of coherence or tension. Leterrier's contribution is to give the premise a more domestic and family-oriented identity. The central question is not simply whether an individual can escape. It is whether an entire family can maintain its relationships while living under extreme conditions. That makes the domestic environment essential to the director's vision. Emotional direction. Leterrier also understands that the movie needs emotional pauses between suspense sequences. The family does not simply spend the entire film running from danger. There are moments of boredom, routine, arguments, affection, grief, and adaptation. Those quieter scenes make the survival premise more believable because prolonged confinement would realistically contain long periods in which nothing dramatic happens. The director therefore allows the film to occasionally slow down and concentrate on relationships. That approach is particularly effective in scenes involving the family's aging dog, Cassidy. The emotional weight of Cassidy's deterioration comes from the fact that the animal represents a familiar part of the family's previous life. The cast has discussed how emotionally difficult the material was to perform. Direction of the actors. Leterrier's direction also benefits from strong performances by Greta Lee and Wagner Moura. The film requires the two actors to communicate long-term emotional exhaustion without making every scene excessively dramatic. Moura's Jason becomes increasingly pressured by his responsibility as a father, while Lee's Anne becomes more active and determined as the family's circumstances deteriorate. The director's restrained handling of many domestic scenes allows those performances to carry emotional weight. Critics have repeatedly identified the leads as one of the movie's stronger elements, even when criticizing the screenplay and larger narrative. Thematic direction. Leterrier's narrative vision is not limited to survival horror. The film also attempts to explore ideas about isolation, environmental destruction, human adaptation, family responsibility, fear of the unknown, the meaning of home, coexistence with unfamiliar forces. The director initially presents the family's imprisonment in a way that can remind audiences of pandemic-era isolation. That connection is one of the film's most obvious thematic elements. The house consequently becomes a metaphor for both safety and confinement. The family wants to escape, but the outside world may be even more dangerous. That contradiction is at the heart of the direction. Where the direction struggles. The main weakness is that Leterrier's visual and atmospheric control is sometimes stronger than the underlying narrative. The early portion establishes a compelling mystery. The family is trapped. The rules are unclear. The threat is unseen. The resources are limited. The situation feels frightening precisely because nobody knows what is happening. But once the film begins explaining the larger mythology, the story becomes increasingly complicated. Decider criticized the movie's tonal shifts and described later developments involving sea creatures and supernatural phenomena as undermining the earlier lockdown commentary. This is ultimately less a failure of visual direction than a problem of narrative cohesion. Leterrier can stage a strange event effectively, but if the screenplay does not provide convincing connective tissue between the grounded family drama and the supernatural explanation, the transition can feel abrupt. Tonal inconsistency. Tone is another challenge. The film begins with a serious, intimate atmosphere. It gradually becomes a survival thriller. Then it develops into science fiction horror with environmental allegory. Those genres can coexist successfully, but they require extremely precise tonal management. Some reviewers believe The Last House struggles in this area. The Guardian praised the early grounded material but found the later horror less successful, while Decider described the tonal movement as jarring. The direction, therefore, has an interesting ambition, but does not always achieve complete tonal unity. Overall directorial vision. Despite its weaknesses, Leterrier gives The Last House a recognizable visual and atmospheric identity. The strongest directorial decisions involve space, isolation, weather, pacing, and the transformation of the home. The film's first half demonstrates particularly strong control because Leterrier understands that the most frightening element is not necessarily the creature outside. It is the realization that the family has lost control of its own home. The director also succeeds in making the audience feel the psychological consequences of prolonged confinement. The house gradually stops looking like a normal home and starts functioning like a survival bunker. Where the direction becomes less successful is in the later mythology. Once the story introduces increasingly elaborate supernatural explanations, the carefully controlled domestic atmosphere becomes harder to maintain. Several critics have argued that the film's screenplay and plot logic weaken what was initially a promising premise. The final assessment. Overall, Louis Leterrier's direction on The Last House is visually polished, atmospheric, and strongest when it remains intimate and character-focused. His most effective directorial idea is the transformation of the home from sanctuary into prison. The confined spaces, persistent rain, limited exits, gradual deterioration, and restrained family drama work together to create a strong feeling of isolation. The pacing is deliberately slow at first, allowing the mystery and psychological pressure to develop before the film escalates into more conventional science fiction horror. The shot composition emphasizes confinement, while the production design and changing condition of the house reinforce the passage of time. However, the direction cannot completely overcome the screenplay's later problems. As the story moves from grounded survival drama into elaborate supernatural mythology, the tone becomes less consistent and the narrative less coherent. Critics have therefore tended to see Leterrier's work as more successful at creating atmosphere and visual momentum than at maintaining a consistently convincing story. In the end, the directorial vision can be summarized as ordinary home, psychological prisons, survival environment, supernatural battleground, uncertain path to freedom. That progression gives The Last House its strongest cinematic identity, even if the later stages do not always match the effectiveness of the film's compelling opening concept. The cinematography of The Last House is one of the film's most important storytelling tools because the movie takes place largely within a single family home. Instead of treating the house as merely a background, cinematographer Paul Ulvik Roxeth and director Louis Leterrier use the camera, lighting, framing, and changing visual texture to make the home feel progressively more restrictive and unfamiliar. Roxeth is officially credited as the film's director of photography, and the production combined 35mm film and digital photography as part of its visual approach. The result is a visual style that starts relatively familiar and intimate before becoming increasingly claustrophobic, bleak, and unsettling as the family's isolation continues. A home designed to feel familiar. One of the most important visual ideas in The Last House is that the family initially occupies an ordinary-looking home. The cinematography, therefore, does not immediately make the house resemble a traditional horror location. Instead, the early imagery gives the environment a recognizable domestic quality. This decision is important because the horror becomes more effective when the audience understands that the characters are trapped somewhere that should normally feel safe. Netflix's first look material specifically presents the family gathered indoors and looking anxiously through a rain-covered window with soft indoor lighting and a muted visual palette. That contrast becomes central to the film. Inside equals familiar and warm. Outside equals mysterious and threatening. As the story progresses, however, that distinction becomes increasingly complicated. The house remains the family's refuge, but it also becomes their prison. The camera as a tool of confinement. The cinematography repeatedly emphasizes the limited amount of physical space available to the family. In a conventional survival movie, characters can escape into forests, cities, roads, buildings, or other environments. Here, the characters are essentially restricted to one location. The camera, therefore, has to make a relatively familiar house feel visually interesting without making the audience forget that the characters are trapped. This is where framing becomes particularly important. The family can be positioned within doorways, hallways, windows, and other architectural boundaries. Such compositions visually reinforce the idea that the characters are surrounded by barriers. The effect is subtle but powerful. The camera does not simply show where the family is. It communicates why the location feels increasingly oppressive. Windows as visual barriers. Windows are particularly important to the film's visual language. They allow the characters to see the outside world, but they do not allow them to reach it. That creates a naturally cinematic form of frustration. The audience can see rain, darkness, and the environment beyond the house, while the family remains physically separated from it. Netflix's promotional images repeatedly emphasize rain-covered and fogged windows, including shots of characters looking outward through condensation and rain streaks. This creates a visual metaphor for the entire story. The outside world is visible, but freedom is inaccessible. The window, therefore, becomes both a frame within the frame and a symbol of confinement. Lighting and the feeling of isolation. Lighting plays a major role in establishing the movie's atmosphere. The interior spaces often retain enough illumination to make the home recognizable, but the lighting is muted rather than bright and cheerful. That choice prevents the house from feeling completely comfortable. There is frequently a sense that daylight is being filtered through an environment that has become permanently gloomy. The exterior rain and the subdued interior lighting create an almost continuous feeling of overcast isolation. Netflix itself described the visual environment in its first look material as tense and reflective, with muted lighting. This approach is particularly appropriate because the movie is not trying to create conventional Gothic darkness. Instead, it creates something more psychologically uncomfortable. The feeling that normal daylight itself has stopped being reassuring. The importance of rain. Rain is arguably the film's most significant visual element. It is not merely weather. It is part of the threat. The family cannot simply look outside and see a normal neighborhood. Their view is constantly dominated by water, reflections, wet surfaces, fogged glass, and an obscured landscape. This gives the exterior imagery a naturally distorted quality. The audience does not receive a clean, reassuring view of the world. Instead, the environment is partially hidden. That visual uncertainty reinforces the narrative mystery. The family does not know what is happening outside, and the cinematography makes sure the audience does not always receive a complete visual explanation either. The 35mm film texture. One of the most interesting technical choices is the use of 35mm film for the first half of the movie. Leterrier explained to Netflix that the filmmakers wanted an analog visual texture inspired by the Spielberg-era Amblin movies he grew up watching. He specifically wanted the house and its surroundings to feel relatable and tactile rather than excessively polished. This is an especially appropriate decision for The Last House. The film begins with something familiar, a family home. Using film stock helps reinforce that sense of physical reality. The image can feel more organic and textured than an aggressively clean digital image. It also gives the ordinary environment a cinematic quality without immediately announcing that the story is a science fiction horror movie. Why the film texture matters to the story. The 35mm approach has a deeper narrative function. The family begins with a relatively recognizable version of normal life. As their situation becomes increasingly abnormal, the visual world also changes. The production's hybrid approach, combining 35mm 3x film and ARRI Alexa 35 digital photography, creates a distinction between different portions of the visual experience. Cinelab, which handled the film processing and scanning, specifically described the production as a hybrid 35mm per Alexa 35 project. This means the format itself becomes part of the film's visual storytelling. The image is not simply there to look attractive. It helps communicate the movement from normality toward abnormality, framing the family together. Another important element is the way the family is frequently presented as a group. The four characters are sometimes positioned close together within the frame. That visual arrangement emphasizes their dependence on one another. When they are physically close, the composition communicates family unity. When individual characters are isolated within the frame, the effect can suggest emotional stress, fear, or separation. This is particularly useful in a movie where the family's survival depends on remaining together. The visual relationship between the characters therefore becomes an extension of the emotional narrative. Close-ups and psychological pressure. Close framing becomes especially effective in a story built around fear and uncertainty. A close-up limits the amount of information available to the viewer. Instead of seeing the entire room, the audience may be encouraged to concentrate on a character's face or reaction. That makes the actor's expression more important. A frightened glance toward a window can communicate more than a long explanation. A character staring at condensation-covered glass can create suspense simply because the audience wants to know what the character sees. The first-look images specifically highlight Greta, Lee hiding in shadows, and Wagner Moura staring through condensation-covered glass, demonstrating how the production uses faces, partial visibility, and obstructed views to build tension. Wide shots and the scale of the house. At the opposite end, wider framing can emphasize how small the family appears within the home. This creates an interesting contradiction. The house is physically large enough for a family to live in comfortably, yet the characters can still feel trapped inside it. A wide composition can therefore communicate both space and confinement simultaneously. The audience sees plenty of physical room, but there's nowhere the characters can actually go. That distinction is central to the movie's premise. The problem is not that the family lacks physical space. The problem is that they lack freedom of movement, shadows, and partial visibility. Shadow is another important visual component. Because the family does not understand what is outside, the cinematography frequently benefits from showing only fragments of the environment. A completely illuminated room gives the audience information. A partially obscured room creates uncertainty. That principle is particularly effective for horror. The camera can allow a shadow, reflection, silhouette, or obscured shape to remain ambiguous instead of immediately revealing exactly what is present. The result is a form of suspense based on anticipation rather than constant revelation. The visual aging of the house. One of the most impressive aspects of the production design is that the house itself was constructed to change over the course of the story. Netflix explains that production designer Kevin Jenkins built a house that could visibly age alongside the characters. Household objects, appliances, children's possessions, and other details were designed to deteriorate as the family's isolation stretched over years. The cinematography benefits enormously from this decision. The camera can return to familiar locations while showing how much they have changed. The same kitchen can gradually look less like a normal kitchen and more like a survival environment. The same rooms can become increasingly cluttered, worn, damaged, or improvised. This creates a visual timeline without requiring the characters to constantly explain how much time has passed. The children and the visual passage of time. The changing appearance of the children is also important. The production uses younger and older performers for Graham and Ruth, allowing the passage of years to become physically visible. From a cinematographic perspective, this is valuable because the audience does not simply have to be told. Years have passed. The visual evidence demonstrates it. The children grow. The house deteriorates. The family's routines change. The environment becomes increasingly unfamiliar. The cinematography therefore participates directly in communicating the film's timeline. Beauty within the horror. Although The Last House is primarily a thriller and horror film, its cinematography is not designed to make every image ugly or oppressive. There are moments in which the rain, muted colors, interior warmth, and family compositions create a strange kind of beauty. That beauty is important because it prevents the film from becoming visually monotonous. The contrast between a relatively peaceful-looking home and the terrifying circumstances surrounding it gives the images emotional complexity. A family sitting together in a dimly lit room can look almost peaceful until the audience remembers why they are sitting there. That contradiction is one of the film's strongest visual ideas. Practical effects and visual realism. The production also emphasized practical effects wherever possible. Leterrier told Netflix that the crew deliberately relied on practical methods alongside the film's visual effects. That choice helps the cinematography maintain a tangible quality. Instead of making every supernatural event appear digitally immaculate, practical elements can give the camera something physical to photograph. This is particularly useful for a contained film because realism helps the audience accept the extraordinary premise. The more believable the physical environment feels, the more unsettling the impossible events become. The shift toward the supernatural. As the film progresses, the visual language increasingly moves away from ordinary domestic realism and towards science fiction horror. The mysterious force outside becomes more visually significant. The rain becomes more threatening. The environment becomes less recognizable. The creatures and effects-heavy material eventually take greater prominence. This transition is ambitious because the cinematography must move from relatable realism to supernatural spectacle. However, this is also where the movie's visual consistency becomes somewhat less powerful. The Guardian found the film's early grounded survival material more compelling than its later science fiction horror developments, while Deciders similarly argued that the film's later genre escalation weakened the impact of the original setup. The issue is therefore not that the later imagery is necessarily unattractive. Rather, the early visual language is so effective at creating intimate uncertainty that the more explicit supernatural imagery can feel comparatively conventional. Cinematography and suspense. The cinematography is most successful when it makes the audience look for information. Instead of showing everything immediately, it encourages viewers to examine windows, shadows, rooms, reflections, and character reactions. This is especially appropriate for a mystery-driven horror story. The audience is essentially placed in the same position as the family. They do not understand what is happening. They cannot see everything outside. They have to interpret fragments. That shared uncertainty makes the cinematography an active storytelling device rather than simple decoration. Visual symbolism. The film's strongest visual symbols are connected to barriers and boundaries. The house. The house represents safety, but eventually becomes imprisonment. The windows. They represent visibility, without freedom. The rain. It represents the mysterious force separating the family from the outside world. The shadows. They represent uncertainty and the things the family cannot understand. The deteriorating interior. It represents the passage of time and the gradual destruction of normal life. The growing children. They represent the fact that the family cannot simply wait indefinitely for the old world to return. Together, these visual elements give the movie a coherent cinematographic language. Does the cinematography create tension? Yes, particularly in the first half. The strongest tension comes from the combination of restricted framing, rain-obscured exterior views, muted interior lighting, close-ups of frightened characters, limited visibility, architectural barriers, practical environmental details, gradual deterioration of the house. These elements allow the cinematography to create suspense without constantly relying on jump scares. The audience understands that something is wrong before it fully understands what that something is. That uncertainty is the visual foundation of the film's early horror, where the cinematography is less effective. The main limitation is that the movie's later visual spectacle cannot always match the psychological intensity of its opening. The early imagery has an advantage because it makes the audience imagine what might be outside. Once the supernatural threat becomes more visible, some of that mystery naturally disappears. This is partly a storytelling issue rather than purely a cinematographic one. The visual effects themselves were produced by major effects teams including Industrial Light and Magic and Untold Studios, among others. But even technically accomplished effects can be less frightening than an unseen threat when the story's strongest weapon is uncertainty. That is why the film's most memorable visual moments are arguably not necessarily its largest effect shots. They are the quieter images. A family staring through a rain-covered window, a frightened figure disappearing into shadow, a dim room filled with exhausted survivors, or familiar household objects gradually showing the evidence of years trapped inside. Overall cinematographic assessment. Overall, Paul Ulvik Roxetha's cinematography gives The Last House a strong visual identity that complements its themes of isolation, survival, and uncertainty. The decision to shoot the first half on 35mm film, combined with practical effects and the carefully constructed aging house, gives the early portion a tactile, grounded quality inspired by the cinematic language of Spielberg and Amblin films. The framing consistently emphasizes the family's lack of freedom, while windows, doors, hallways, shadows, and rain become recurring visual symbols of confinement. The muted lighting establishes an atmosphere that is tense without becoming excessively stylized. The strongest aspect of the cinematography is its ability to make ordinary domestic spaces feel increasingly unfamiliar. The camera does not simply show a family trapped inside a house. It shows the gradual transformation of that house from home, shelter, prison, survival environment. The later science fiction material is visually more effects-driven and, according to several critics, less emotionally powerful than the grounded first half. Nevertheless, the cinematography remains an important strength because it gives the film a coherent visual metaphor for confinement. Ultimately, the camera work succeeds because it understands that the most frightening image is not always the creature outside the window. It can be the window itself, because it represents a world that the family can see but can no longer reach. The editing and pacing of The Last House are especially important because the film has a relatively contained premise. A family is trapped inside their home and must survive while trying to understand what is keeping them there. With a runtime of approximately 1 hour and 50 minutes, the film has to balance domestic drama, survival tension, mystery, science fiction horror, and an increasingly large supernatural storyline. The editing is handled within a broader post-production team that includes Thomas Lambert and Jeremy Crichton, with additional editorial personnel credited on the production. The resulting rhythm is deliberately uneven. The first portion allows the situation to breathe, while the later sections accelerate as the family's survival becomes more urgent, establishing the rhythm in the opening. The opening portion of The Last House uses a relatively restrained editing rhythm. Rather than immediately cutting rapidly between threats, the film allows the audience to spend time with the family and understand their normal routine before that routine is destroyed. This is an important choice. The central premise depends on the audience understanding how strange it is for an ordinary home to suddenly become completely inaccessible. If the editing moved too quickly from the beginning, the emotional significance of that transformation would be reduced. The early editing, therefore, allows scenes to play long enough for the audience to absorb the family's relationships, their confusion, the strange weather, the disappearance of communication, the limitations placed on the house, and the realization that the situation is not temporary. The slower rhythm gives the opening a slow-burn survival thriller quality. The editing creates a feeling of confinement. One of the clever aspects of the editing is that the film does not need to constantly show the characters physically attempting to escape. The repetition of domestic routines itself communicates imprisonment. The family remains inside. They move between the same rooms. They repeatedly confront the same barriers. They return to the same conversations. From an editing perspective, This repetition creates a sense of visual and narrative circularity. The audience begins to understand that the family is not simply waiting for the next scene to take them somewhere new. There may be nowhere new to go. That is an appropriate rhythm for a story about confinement. Pacing the mystery. The first half also benefits from withholding information. The film does not immediately explain the strange force keeping the family trapped. Instead, information is delivered incrementally. This creates a rhythm of observation, discovery, reaction, adaptation, new mystery. That structure keeps the audience asking questions. What is happening outside? Why can the family not leave? Why has communication disappeared? How long will the situation continue? What exactly is responsible for the phenomenon? The Daily Beast praised the early suspense and the film's ability to maintain a mysterious atmosphere, while also noting that the eventual lack of satisfying answers becomes a weakness. This distinction is important because mystery and confusion are not the same thing. The early editing uses mystery effectively. The later narrative sometimes allows confusion to replace it. The passage of time. Editing becomes particularly important when the story moves across a long period of confinement. The family does not remain trapped for merely a few days. The story progresses through a prolonged period in which the characters adapt to their circumstances. The editors therefore have to communicate the passage of time without showing every repetitive day. This requires elliptical editing. Instead of watching every stage of the family's survival, the audience is taken between important moments. The house changes. The children grow. Supplies disappear. The family's routines evolve. Their psychological state deteriorates. These transitions allow the film to communicate that substantial time has passed without turning the movie into a repetitive account of daily survival. Why the time jumps matter? The time jumps have two different effects. On one hand, they are necessary. A literal depiction of 5 years inside the house would make the film extraordinarily repetitive. The editors need to skip unimportant periods and concentrate on events that change the family's situation. On the other hand, some viewers may feel that certain developments happen too abruptly because the film moves across time without always allowing every emotional consequence to fully develop. This is one reason the pacing has received criticism. A Reddit discussion about the film, for example, specifically complained about abrupt transitions and time jumps, arguing that some developments did not receive enough build-up. That is a viewer reaction rather than a critical consensus, but it illustrates the pacing concern some audiences have expressed. The middle section, survival becomes routine. The middle portion is deliberately different from the opening. Once the family understands that they may be trapped for an extended period, the story becomes less about discovering the basic rules and more about living under those rules. This creates an interesting pacing challenge. The film needs to show adaptation without becoming boring. The editors, therefore, have to select only the most meaningful survival developments. The family learns to conserve resources. They establish new routines. They attempt to grow food. They find ways to keep themselves occupied. They deal with physical and emotional deterioration. This material is slower than a conventional action thriller, but it is essential to the movie's thematic purpose. The Guardian specifically noted that the film's grounded survival sections are among its stronger elements, particularly when it focuses on the mundane realities of isolation, resource depletion, and family adaptation. The rhythm of domestic scenes. The editing works best when it allows the domestic scenes to breathe. That may initially seem counterintuitive for a thriller. However, a family trapped inside a home would realistically experience long periods of routine interrupted by moments of danger. The editing therefore reflects the character's experience. Long periods of waiting, sudden disruption, emotional consequences, return to routine. This pattern is more believable than maintaining non-stop suspense. It also makes the moments of genuine danger more effective because the audience has been allowed to settle into the family's routine first. The dog sequence. The emotional sequence involving Cassidy, the family's aging dog, demonstrates another important editing function. The scene is not simply designed to move the plot forward. It is designed to allow the audience to experience loss. The film's cast has discussed the emotional difficulty of filming the sequence, and audience reactions have also highlighted how strongly the scene affected viewers. The editing, therefore, has to resist the temptation to move immediately to the next plot development. The emotional beat needs space. The audience has to understand what Cassidy means to the family before the loss can have its intended effect. That slower emotional rhythm provides one of the film's strongest contrasts, with the more rushed later sections. Escalation toward the final act. As the story moves toward the climax, the editing becomes increasingly urgent. The family's circumstances become more dangerous, and the narrative begins connecting several previously separate elements. The threat outside becomes more immediate. The family's resources become more limited. Health concerns create additional pressure. The possibility of leaving the house becomes increasingly important. The editing, consequently, begins shortening the distance between major story beats. This produces a sense that the family's long period of waiting is finally coming to an end. The film moves from, how can they survive here?
Toward,
how can they get out? That change in narrative question naturally produces faster pacing. The genre shift affects the editing. The film's most significant pacing problem emerges when it moves from grounded survival thriller into overt science fiction horror. The Guardian observed that the grounded survival storyline is more compelling than the later sci-fi horror material, while Decider described the movie as suffering from tonal inconsistency and a convoluted plot. From an editing perspective, this creates a problem because the rhythm of the two halves is fundamentally different. The first half depends on silence, uncertainty, repetition, observation, emotional buildup. The later half depends more heavily on revelations, creature encounters, action, explanations, confrontation, resolution. The transition between those rhythms is not always seamless. The film feels like two different movies. This is perhaps the most important criticism of the editing and pacing. The first portion feels like an intimate psychological survival thriller. The later portion feels more like a conventional supernatural creature movie. Tom's Guide described the film as effectively becoming a story of two disjointed halves, arguing that the abrupt genre shift weakens the impact of the promising opening. The editing contributes to that sensation because the movie's rhythm changes along with its genre. The first half asks the audience to sit with uncertainty. The second half increasingly asks the audience to process explanations and action. As a result, the film does not always feel like one continuous escalation. Does the pacing drag? Yes, there are portions that can feel slow. However, that slowness is not necessarily a flaw. The slower pace is most defensible when the film is showing the psychological consequences of isolation. The family needs time to adapt. The audience needs time to understand their new reality. The house needs time to become oppressive. The relationships need time to deteriorate and change. The problem arises when scenes feel slow without adding a meaningful new emotional or narrative development. Some viewers have criticized the movie for feeling substantially longer than its actual runtime, particularly because of the repetitive middle sections and uneven build-up. That reaction suggests that the editing does not always distinguish perfectly between deliberate slow-burn pacing and narrative stagnation. Does the film rush anything? The answer is also yes, particularly toward the end. The final act has considerably more information and action to process. The film has to explain the larger mystery, establish the nature of the creatures, resolve the family's immediate survival problem, and provide an ending. Because the runtime remains limited, these developments arrive relatively quickly. This creates the opposite problem from the middle section. The middle can feel stretched. The final section can feel compressed. That imbalance is one of the movie's biggest pacing weaknesses. The final act and accelerated rhythm. Once the family begins actively attempting to escape, the editing becomes more conventional. Scenes become shorter. The stakes become more immediate. There is less time for contemplation. The film increasingly moves from one event to another. This is appropriate for the climax in principle. A thriller should accelerate toward its conclusion. However, acceleration works best when the audience feels that the story has naturally earned the escalation. In The Last House, some critics have felt that the climax introduces too many ideas too quickly. Decider specifically criticized the increasingly complicated plot and the supernatural developments that arrive after the more grounded opening. Therefore, the issue is not simply the ending is too fast. The deeper issue is that the movie has more narrative material to resolve than its pacing structure comfortably allows. Transitions between major story periods. The transitions across time are another important part of the editing. The movie has to jump between different stages of the family's imprisonment without losing continuity. When those transitions work, they are efficient. The audience immediately understands that the family has moved into another phase of survival. When they do not work as effectively, the audience may feel that important emotional developments have happened off-screen. This can make the characters' transformations appear more sudden than they actually are. The editing, therefore, sometimes prioritizes narrative efficiency over emotional continuity. That is understandable in a 110-minute film, but it occasionally reduces the weight of certain developments. Editing and character development. The editing also influences how much character development the audience experiences. Jason and Anne's relationship benefits from scenes that are allowed to unfold naturally. Their disagreements, moments of cooperation, and emotional exhaustion require time. If those scenes were cut too aggressively, the family dynamic would become superficial. The film is strongest when the editing allows viewers to observe the characters rather than simply receiving information about them. This is consistent with the broader critical response. Even critics who dislike the screenplay often acknowledge that Wagner Moura and Greta provide much of the movie's emotional strength. Editing and suspense. The most effective suspense comes from delayed information. A cutaway from a character approaching something dangerous can make the audience anticipate what will happen next. A reaction shot can conceal the source of fear. A cut from inside the house to the rain outside can remind viewers that the threat remains present even when it is not physically visible. This kind of editing allows the film to create suspense without constantly showing its monsters. The early portion benefits significantly from this strategy. The later portion, once more of the threat is revealed, naturally loses some of that mystery. Sound and editing rhythm. Although sound design and music belong to separate departments, editing rhythm is closely connected to them. A long, quiet scene creates room for subtle environmental sounds. A sudden cut can be emphasized by a musical or sound design change. Rapid sequences can use increasingly short intervals between visual and sonic events. In a film built around rain and confinement, this relationship is particularly important. The repetitive sound of rain can become almost part of the editing rhythm itself. The audience becomes accustomed to it. Then moments when that rhythm changes become more noticeable. This helps maintain tension even during relatively quiet sequences. The emotional rhythm. The film's emotional rhythm can be summarized as normality, confusion, fear, adaptation, exhaustion, grief, renewed danger, confrontation, escape. The strongest sections allow each emotional phase to develop before moving into the next. The weaker sections sometimes move too abruptly between emotional states. For example, when the movie introduces a new supernatural development shortly after an emotionally significant family sequence, the audience may not have enough time to process the earlier moment before being asked to focus on the next plot revelation. That weakens emotional continuity. Editing as a reflection of confinement. There is an interesting contradiction in the editing. The family is trapped in one physical location, yet the story has to remain visually and narratively dynamic. The editors solve this by making time itself the main variable. The location remains relatively constant. The people change. The house changes. The supplies change. The threat changes. The family's understanding changes. This means that the editing creates movement through time and character development rather than geography. That is one of the more appropriate editorial strategies for this particular story. Overall assessment. Overall, the editing and pacing of The Last House 2026 are effective in the first half but increasingly uneven as the movie approaches its conclusion. The opening uses patient editing to establish the family's isolation and create mystery. The middle portion uses time jumps and selective scenes to communicate years of survival without showing every repetitive day. The emotional sequences benefit when the editing slows down enough to let the characters' experiences register. The principal weakness is the imbalance between the middle and final portions. The film can feel too slow while establishing long-term survival and too fast when resolving its supernatural mythology. The genre shift also affects the rhythm. What begins as a carefully paced domestic survival thriller gradually becomes a more effects-driven science fiction horror movie, and several critics have argued that this transition weakens the film's original tension. Nevertheless, the editing succeeds at creating several distinct rhythmic phases. Slow and mysterious in the beginning, methodical and repetitive in the middle, emotionally intense during major losses, increasingly fast toward the climax. The film's greatest editorial strength is its ability to make the audience feel the long passage of confinement without literally showing every day. Its greatest weakness is that the final act attempts to resolve too many narrative questions too quickly. Ultimately, The Last House demonstrates that pacing is not simply about how quickly a movie moves. In this case, the rhythm is part of the story itself. The slow sections make the audience feel trapped with the family, while the increasingly rapid final act reflects their desperate attempt to escape that confinement. The music and soundscape of The Last House play an important supporting role in creating its atmosphere of isolation, uncertainty, and gradually escalating danger. Because much of the film takes place inside a single home, the score has to do more than simply accompany action. It has to make ordinary spaces feel threatening, give emotional weight to the family's experiences, and help the story transition from an intimate survival drama into a supernatural science fiction thriller. The film score is composed by Rob Simonson, whose work is known for combining orchestral writing with modern electronic textures. For The Last House, that approach is particularly appropriate because the story moves between a recognizable family drama and a strange, increasingly otherworldly environment, establishing the musical atmosphere. The score does not need to dominate the opening. In fact, one of the more effective aspects of the film's sound design is its restraint. The opening sections are built around uncertainty. The family does not understand why they cannot leave, and the audience is similarly kept in the dark. A huge orchestral score would immediately tell the audience that something extraordinary is happening. Instead, the film benefits from a quieter approach. The music often functions almost like an emotional undercurrent, allowing environmental sounds, especially rain, wind, footsteps, doors, and household noises, to remain important. This creates a feeling that the threat is already present even when nothing visibly dangerous is happening. Rain as part of the soundscape. The sound of rain is particularly important. Rain is not simply background atmosphere in The Last House. It becomes one of the recurring sonic elements associated with the family's imprisonment. The constant presence of rainfall creates a kind of auditory boundary between the family and the outside world. Inside the house, the audience hears a relatively controlled domestic environment. Outside, there is the continuous sound of rain and an increasingly unfamiliar world. That contrast reinforces one of the movie's central ideas. The family can hear the outside world, even though they cannot safely enter it. The rain consequently becomes almost a musical motif of its own. Silence as a source of tension. Silence is arguably just as important as the composed music. The film understands that horror becomes less effective if every potentially frightening moment is accompanied by an obvious musical cue. Silence allows the audience to listen carefully. A quiet hallway becomes suspicious. A pause in conversation becomes uncomfortable. A character standing near a window becomes tense simply because there is no musical instruction telling the audience what to feel. This approach is particularly effective in a movie about uncertainty. The characters do not know what is outside. The audience does not always know what is outside. Silence preserves that uncertainty. The difference between music and sound design. One of the film's strengths is that the score does not have to carry the entire atmosphere by itself. The sound design works alongside it. The house produces its own sounds. Rain against windows, doors opening and closing, footsteps, objects being moved, appliances and household machinery, water, wind, distant environmental noises. These sounds make the home feel physically real. That realism is important because the supernatural elements become more disturbing when they enter an otherwise believable sonic environment. The ordinary sounds establish reality. The unusual sounds disrupt it. Music during the family scenes. The score also contributes to the emotional relationship between Jason and their children. The film is not solely about escaping a supernatural threat. It is also about a family attempting to remain emotionally connected while living under extraordinary pressure. During quieter family scenes, the music tends to function as emotional reinforcement rather than spectacle. This is particularly important because the characters experience prolonged isolation. Their emotional exhaustion cannot always be communicated through dialogue. A restrained musical cue can suggest sadness, uncertainty, affection, or exhaustion without requiring the characters to explain those feelings. Jason and Anne's emotional relationship. The relationship between Jason and Anne provides one of the most important emotional foundations for the score. Their marriage is placed under extraordinary pressure, and their decisions increasingly involve life-or-death consequences for their children. Music can emphasize the emotional distance between them during disagreements and their underlying connection during moments of cooperation. The score, therefore, helps maintain the idea that the movie remains a family drama underneath its science fiction premise. That is important because, without the emotional foundation provided by the family, the later supernatural material would have considerably less. Music during moments of grief. The score becomes particularly significant during the film's emotional losses. The death of Cassidy, the family's dog, is one of the clearest examples. The scene works because the movie allows the emotional response to exist without immediately turning it into an action sequence. Music can support the character's grief without overwhelming it. The cast has spoken about the emotional difficulty of filming Cassidy's death sequence, and the strong audience reaction to that moment demonstrates how effectively the film connects its survival situation with personal loss. The most effective approach in such scenes is usually restraint. If the music became excessively sentimental, the emotion could feel manipulated. Instead, the soundscape works best when the score allows the actors' performances and the surrounding silence to remain audible. Building suspense. As the family discovers more about the outside world, the musical language becomes increasingly tense. The score can introduce sustained tones, low-frequency textures, electronic elements, or gradually developing orchestral patterns to communicate that something is approaching. This creates suspense without requiring an immediate visual threat. The audience can hear the danger before seeing it. That technique is particularly effective in a movie where the outside world is often obscured by rain, darkness, and distance. The mystery of the creatures. The mysterious creatures require a different musical treatment. At first, they are not fully understood. The score therefore benefits from ambiguity rather than giving them a conventional monster theme. Instead of immediately establishing a recognizable musical identity, the soundscape can make their presence feel unfamiliar. This is appropriate because the film eventually complicates the family's understanding of the creatures. They initially appear to be enemies, but the narrative ultimately suggests a more complicated relationship between humanity and these beings. The music consequently has to support uncertainty rather than simply communicating. The monster has arrived. Recurring musical ideas. The score's most effective recurring idea is not necessarily a traditional melody. Instead, it is a musical progression from intimacy toward uncertainty. The early music is more grounded. As the family situation becomes stranger, the sonic palette becomes increasingly atmospheric. This gradual transformation mirrors the narrative itself. The family begins in a recognizable domestic environment. They gradually realize that the rules of their world have changed. The music follows that journey. The result is a score that functions less as a collection of instantly recognizable themes and more as a continuously evolving emotional atmosphere. Orchestral and electronic elements. Rob Simonson's style makes the combination of orchestral and electronic sounds particularly useful for the movie. Orchestral instruments can represent the human and emotional side of the story. Electronic textures can represent the unfamiliar world outside. The combination allows the music to occupy a space between human drama and science fiction. That is exactly where the film itself exists. The family is experiencing a deeply human crisis, but the cause of that crisis is increasingly supernatural and unexplained. The hybrid sound therefore reinforces the film's genre combination, the sound of the outside world. Another important function of the soundscape is to make the outside world feel larger than the house. The The family sees only limited portions of what is happening beyond the windows, but sound can suggest that the environment extends much farther than what the camera shows. Distant noises, rain, wind, water, and unusual environmental sounds can imply that something enormous is occurring beyond the family's immediate surroundings. This creates an important contrast. Visually, the family is trapped in a small space. Sonically, they are surrounded by a huge and unknowable world. That is one of the film's strongest uses of sound, the role of silence during exploration. Whenever a character ventures into a dangerous or unfamiliar area, excessive music could reduce the suspense. Silence or near silence instead forces the audience to listen. Footsteps become important. Breathing becomes noticeable. Small environmental noises suddenly feel threatening. This creates a more intimate kind of suspense. The audience becomes hyper-aware of every sound because the characters themselves have become hyper-aware of their surroundings. Music and the passage of time. The long period of confinement also affects the way music functions. The family does not remain in the same emotional state throughout the entire story. At first, there is panic. Then comes adaptation. Then exhaustion. Then grief. Then determination. The score has to reflect these changing emotional states. A constant level of tension would become exhausting for the audience and would fail to represent the family's psychological development. Instead, the music can become quieter and more restrained during periods of routine before gradually returning to tension when new threats appear. This variation keeps the film from becoming sonically monotonous. The score during the climax. As the film approaches its climax, the music naturally becomes more prominent. The family is no longer simply waiting. They are actively attempting to change their circumstances. The stakes become more immediate, and the score helps accelerate the emotional rhythm. The music becomes larger and